is the central nervous system. We know that central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. These essential structures are both well protected from damage and the injury. The brain is enclosed within the skull and the spinal cord, and by the vertebrae there is a spinal column which is protected by the vertebrae. Membranous covering that is known as the meninges around the whole brain. The structure and the function of the meninges in the brain and spinal cord is going to be discussed next. So central nervous system क्या है हमारे पास? That is a part of nervous system consisting primarily of the brain and the spinal cord. Both structures are well protected. Central nervous system consists of two major parts. So I'll repeat: brain and the spinal cord, which are making the central nervous system. Brain is covered by the meninges and protected by the skull, and the spinal cord is protected by the meninges and vertebrae. And vertebrae are small discs which are not joined together by some hard thing, so that we could move easily, so that we can bend easily. After that, the diagram in which the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system is shown. Central nervous system में जैसे कि मैंने आपको बताया ब्रेन और स्पाइनल कॉर्ड दोनों मिलकर सेंट्रल नर्वस सिस्टम बनाते हैं. एंड पेरिफेरल में क्या होता है कि जो स्पाइनल कॉर्ड में से नर्व्स निकल रही होती हैं वो आगे जाकर पेरिफेरल नर्वस सिस्टम बनाती हैं, जिसमें सारी की सारी नर्व्स आती हैं. एज वी हैव स्टडीड बिफोर व्हाट इज अ नर्व, and the ganglions come in over there. I have told you before what are ganglions, so we are going to write it over here that what are ganglions. Then we'll come to the ventricles of the brain. These are the four ventricles of the brain जिसकी हम बात करते हैं. What are the four ventricles of the brain? The first one is the lateral ventricle. ठीक है. These cavities lie within the cerebral hemisphere, one on each side of the median plane, just below the corpus callosum. And these are separated from each other by a thin membrane, the septum lucidum, and they are lined with the ciliated epithelium. They communicate with the third ventricle by the interventricular foramina. The third ventricle is a cavity situated below the lateral ventricles between the two parts of the thalamus. It communicates with the fourth ventricle by a canal, that is cerebral aqueduct. Then comes the fourth ventricle. The fourth ventricle is a diamond-shaped cavity situated below and behind the third ventricle, between the cerebellum and the pons. It is continuous below with the central canal of the spinal cord and communicates with the subarachnoid space by the foramina and its roof. Cerebrospinal fluid enters the subarachnoid space through these openings and through the open distal end of the central canal of the spinal cord. So these are the ventricles of the brain. So next is the cerebrospinal fluid. What is a cerebrospinal fluid? Cerebrospinal fluid is secreted into each ventricle of the brain by the choroid plexus. ये क्या होते हैं? These are the vascular areas where there is a proliferation of the blood vessels surrounded by the ependymal cells in the lining of the ventricle walls. CSF passes back into the blood through tiny diverticula of arachnoid matter called the arachnoid villi, arachnoid granulation, which project into the venous sinuses. The movement of the CSF from the subarachnoid space to the venous sinuses depends upon the difference in the pressure on each side of the wall of the arachnoid villi, which act as a one-way valve. When the CSF pressure is higher than the venous pressure, CSF is pushed into the blood, and when the venous pressure is higher, the arachnoid villi collapse, preventing the passage of the blood constituents in the CSF. There may also be some reabsorption of the CSF by cells in the walls of the ventricles. From the roof of the fourth ventricle, the CSF flows through the foramina into the subarachnoid space and completely surrounds the brain and the spinal cord. There is no intrinsic system of the central nervous cerebrospinal fluid circulation, but its movement is aided by pulsating the blood vessels, the respiration, and the changes of the posture. CSF is actually secreted at a rate of 0.5 milliliter per minute and 720 milliliter per day. The volume remains fairly constant at about 150 milliliters as absorption keeps pace with the Secretion. CSF pressure may be measured using a ventricle tube attached to a lumbar puncture needle inserted into the subarachnoid space above or below the fourth lumbar vertebra, which is below the end of the spinal cord. The pressure remains fairly constant at about 10 centimeter water when lying on one side and about 30 centimeter water when splitting up. If the brain is enlarged, the hemorrhage or the tumor in some compensations is made by the reduction of amount of CSF. So when the volume of the brain tissue is reduced, such as the degeneration or the atrophy, जब इसका वॉल्यूम कम हो जाएगा तो जब हम कहेंगे कि ब्रेन टिश्यू का वॉल्यूम कम हो जाएगा तो इस CSF का वॉल्यूम ज़्यादा हो जाएगा. CSF is clear slightly alkaline fluid with a specific gravity of 1.005. इसमें क्या होता है? It has water, it has mineral salts, glucose, plasma proteins, some of the leukocytes and creatinine and the urea in the small amounts. What is the function of the cerebrospinal fluid? The function of the cerebrospinal fluid, it supports and protects the brain and spinal cord by maintaining a uniform pressure around these vital structures and acting as a cushion or shock absorber between the brain and the skull. It keeps the brain and spinal cord moist, and there may be exchange of nutrients and waste products between CSF and the interstitial fluid of the brain. CSF is thought to be involved in the regulation of the breathing as it bathes the surface of the medulla where the central respiratory chemoreceptors are located. There are four functions: buoyancy, protection, preventing of the brain ischemia, and the next one is homeostasis and the clearing the waste. So what is buoyancy? The actual mass of the human brain is about 1400, that 1400 grams to 1500 grams. However, the net weight of the brain suspended in the CSF is equivalent to a mass of 25 to 50 grams. The brain therefore exists in a neural buoyancy, which allows the brain to maintain its density without being impaired by its own weight, which would cut off blood supply and kill neurons in the lower sections above within the CSF. And protection, CSF किस तरह से protect करता है from the injury it jolted or hit? It is a fluid that is there to absorb the shock. It acts as a shock absorber from some forms of the mechanical injury. It prevents from the brain ischemia. How is that possible? The prevention of the brain ischemia is added by decreasing the amount of CSF in the limited space inside the skull. This decreases total intracranial pressure and facilitates blood perfusion. Is homeostasis. So what is homeostasis? To maintain the internal balance according to the harms of the fluctuations of the outer environment. Homeostasis involves the CSF, allows for the regulation of the distribution of the substances between the cells of the brain and the neuroendocrine factors, to which slight changes can cause problems or damage to the nervous system. For example, high glycine concentration disrupts the temperature and blood pressure control, and high CSF pH causes the dizziness and the syncope. Clearing the waste. CSF allows for the removal of the waste products from the brain, and it's critical in the brain's lymphatic system called the lymphatic system. Metabolic waste products diffuse rapidly into the CSF and are removed into the bloodstreams as the CSF is absorbed. When this goes away, the CSF can be toxic, such as in amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, the commonest form of the motor neuron disease.